I think more shock and dauntingness was more the feeling I felt. But it was, the thing is, it's...
Prince William believed he understood what his grandmother had left behind. The titles were known. The ceremonial treasures had been catalogued. The great royal estates followed rules older than anyone alive. But one private inheritance had remained outside that machinery entirely. And when a sealed instruction connected directly to Queen Elizabeth II was finally placed before William, his reaction was not triumph. He stopped speaking, because what she had secretly preserved for him carried something far more personal than money. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William entered the private meeting expecting routine business. Instead, an executor placed a carefully prepared file before him and explained that the late monarch had created a protected private inheritance specifically for her grandson. A private inheritance meant possessions and money owned personally by Elizabeth rather than property belonging to the crown, the institution that holds official royal assets for the reigning sovereign and the nation. This distinction mattered enormously. The secluded family property, personal heirlooms, correspondence, and financial trust being described were not symbols of public office. They were hers to give, and she had chosen him. The prince read the first page once, then again. His expression changed as the meaning settled in. Elizabeth had ordered that the inheritance remain undisclosed until several family conditions had been satisfied, and those instructions had survived her death untouched. William slowly lowered himself into a chair and asked the question nobody in the room could soften. Why had his grandmother never told him herself? The executor could only point to a documented account accompanying the arrangement, where the Queen had explained that revealing the gift too early could destroy the very protection she intended it to provide. Charles received his own confirmation soon afterward. The king did not erupt or demand explanations. He simply went quiet. He understood succession better than anyone, the process by which royal authority passes from one sovereign to the next. But this decision sat outside that system. His mother had made a private choice, one that neither the crown nor her eldest son had been meant to control. Charles read the summary twice before setting it down, already realizing that Elizabeth had anticipated consequences reaching far beyond money. William soon discovered the most unsettling detail. His grandmother had not only written what he would inherit, she had written why she believed he would eventually need it. Yet the explanation itself remained inside a sealed personal message, reserved for him alone. The executor placed that envelope nearby, but told the future king not to open it until he understood every condition attached to the inheritance. Then came the detail that changed everything. According to the documented instructions, another member of the royal family had known for years that Elizabeth had protected something privately for William. Someone close to him had carried the secret through family dinners, ceremonies, grief, and succession without saying a word. William had just discovered what his grandmother left him. Now he had to discover who had been carrying her secret and why they had never warned him. The inheritance stunned William because of what it contained, but the silence surrounding it hurt even more. Elizabeth had trusted lawyers, executors, and one carefully chosen family intermediary to protect the arrangement long after her death. Charles knew fragments. Anne understood more. William knew almost nothing. Suddenly, what looked like generosity began feeling like a message passed around him in whispers, and every person sitting closest to the late Queen appeared to be carrying a different piece of the truth. William had always known his relationship with Queen Elizabeth II was different. She was his grandmother, but she was also the sovereign who had spent years preparing him for a future he could never simply walk away from. A sovereign is the reigning monarch, the person who formally stands at the head of the monarchy. Elizabeth understood that William's future would eventually demand not only ceremony and discipline, but emotional sacrifice. She had watched him grow into that burden slowly, often speaking to him with the calm patience of someone who knew exactly what waited ahead. Charles understood another side of that burden. As king, he had inherited the crown and the responsibility of keeping the institution stable. But he also knew his mother had always drawn a firm line between official royal continuity and private family choices. William wanted to know whether that line explained the secrecy, so he went directly to his father and asked the question without softening it. Had Charles known about the inheritance? Charles hesitated. The silence itself became an answer before the words arrived. According to a documented account of their private exchange, the king admitted that Elizabeth had once told him, "William will need something that belongs only to him." He had not been shown the full arrangement. He had not known the exact property, the trust, or the personal collection. But he had known enough to understand that his mother was preparing something separate from the crown. William turned away almost immediately. That admission hurt more than the details of the inheritance. He had spent years trusting that the people closest to him would speak plainly when his future was being shaped. Now he was discovering that those same people had carried pieces of a secret involving his own life. Charles did not move toward him. He remained beside the table and quietly explained that Elizabeth believed timing mattered as much as truth. Then Anne's name entered the conversation. Through a recorded family account, preserved with the executor's notes, it became clear that the Princess Royal had known a private arrangement existed. Her role was limited, but deliberate. Elizabeth had trusted her daughter because Anne was unlikely to turn the gift into leverage, gossip, or family bargaining. Anne later explained to William that revealing the inheritance too early could have poisoned it. Money, property, and private heirlooms could become tools of pressure once everyone knew they existed. Elizabeth wanted the gift protected from expectation before William ever touched it. Then Anne gave him the detail that changed the direction of everything. The secrecy had not begun gradually. It began after one specific family gathering. One evening Elizabeth never forgot. And according to Anne, Elizabeth chose that timing only after one private evening convinced her that William would someday need protection from pressures inside his own family. Years before William received the inheritance, Elizabeth had already made a different plan. The property was expected to pass elsewhere. The personal collection had not been assembled for him. Even the trust did not yet exist in its final form. Then came one private gathering that changed her thinking. Nothing exploded publicly. No announcement followed. But sometime between a difficult family conversation and the closing of a drawing room door, the Queen quietly decided that William needed something the monarchy itself could never promise him: independence. Elizabeth regularly reviewed her private family arrangements as circumstances changed, and that distinction mattered. Personal property belonged to her as an individual, while assets tied to the sovereign or royal institutions followed rules larger than any one family member. William, meanwhile, had become increasingly exposed to pressures few others carried. He was expected to absorb family tension, protect the future reputation of the crown, and still prepare himself for a role that would eventually define almost every part of his life. Then came the Windsor Supper that changed everything. According to a documented family account preserved with later inheritance papers, a tense argument broke out over how much control the wider family should have over William's future household, private decisions, and personal resources. The discussion grew sharper than expected. The prince listened as duty, money, loyalty, and obligation became tangled together. Elizabeth said little while the disagreement unfolded, but she watched him closely. William finally rose to leave once the others had gone. He had almost reached the door when Queen Elizabeth II called him back. She asked him to sit with her for a few more minutes. The monarch did not lecture him. She asked one question: did he believe duty had left enough room for him to remain himself? William tried to answer, stopped, and then admitted that sometimes he feared there would eventually be no part of his life untouched by expectation. Elizabeth did not correct him. That silence mattered more than reassurance. She had spent decades understanding what the crown could demand from a person, and she knew her grandson was beginning to feel the same pressure long before he actually wore it. Later that evening, Anne found her mother alone. According to a recorded conversation later summarized for the executors, the Queen told her daughter that a future king who owned nothing emotionally separate from the institution risked forgetting who he was outside it. Within weeks, Elizabeth began changing her private plans. Advisors were instructed to restructure the secluded property, preserve the personal collection, and build the protected trust that would eventually be disclosed to William. The inheritance was no longer simply a gift. It had become a shield. Anne later revealed one final detail through a documented account. Her mother insisted that ordinary family pressure must never be able to alter the arrangement after her death. No bargaining, no emotional leverage, no quiet rewriting. Elizabeth's gift had been born from concern. But when William finally understood how carefully she had protected it, concern began to look dangerously close to warning. William could accept that Elizabeth had kept secrets. She had spent a lifetime doing exactly that for the sake of the crown. What he could not accept was the possibility that his own father understood why those protections were necessary and had still allowed him to walk blindly toward them. So William went directly to Charles. No aides, no secretaries, no carefully prepared briefing. Just a son, a father, and one question powerful enough to strip away every layer of royal formality. William already knew the king had possessed only fragments of the truth. Charles had never seen the complete inheritance instructions, but even limited knowledge now felt dangerous, because the prince understood that his grandmother had deliberately built protections around him. Those inheritance instructions were the written directions controlling when and how her private gift could be disclosed. For Charles, the meeting was equally painful. He had to explain his mother's secrecy without making his son believe he had helped deceive him. William did not waste time. According to a recorded private conversation preserved in a family account, he looked at his father and asked, "Did Grandmama believe I needed protecting from this family?" Charles did not answer immediately. He moved a chair aside, closed the door himself, and stood in silence for several seconds. Then the king finally said, Elizabeth had not feared one person. She feared what pressure, duty, expectation, and succession could make people become when too much was at stake. William pushed harder. He wanted to know whether his father had ever objected to the arrangement. Charles admitted that he had. The monarch had warned Elizabeth that secrecy could one day make William question his loyalty, especially if the inheritance surfaced after her death. He feared exactly what was happening now. A son wondering whether his father had stood beside him or silently watched from the other side of a locked door. Charles removed his glasses and set them beside the file. William waited for resistance, but none came. According to the documented account, the king admitted his mother had anticipated this confrontation. Elizabeth had refused to reverse her decision because she believed William would eventually understand that the inheritance was not an attack on Charles, the wider family, or the crown. It was protection from a burden, not protection from a person. Then Charles revealed the detail that changed the argument completely. Elizabeth had deliberately blocked the inheritance from being released during the earliest part of his reign. She knew that if William received a large private legacy immediately after Charles became king, it could be interpreted as a silent judgment on the new monarch. Her delay was designed to protect both men from suspicion. William finally understood that his grandmother had planned around their relationship as carefully as she had planned the inheritance itself. But one question remained. Someone had still decided when the conditions were finally satisfied. The confrontation cleared Charles of the darkest suspicion, but it exposed something else. Elizabeth had built an entire human firewall around the inheritance, and someone still held the final key. Royal power usually announces itself through titles, signatures, and ceremony. Elizabeth's final safeguard worked differently. She placed the most sensitive part of William's inheritance behind something far harder to manipulate: personal trust. The decisive authority did not belong solely to Charles, William, or the machinery surrounding the crown. The late Queen had chosen a small circle, and among them one family member carried an extraordinary responsibility. Princess Anne had spent years saying almost nothing. Now silence was no longer required. Anne had always been one of Elizabeth's most disciplined confidants. She was direct, private, and far less interested in palace influence than in carrying out her mother's wishes exactly as they had been given. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally held by the sovereign's eldest daughter, had not been granted ownership of William's inheritance. Her role was narrower, but more powerful in one crucial sense. She had been trusted to confirm when Elizabeth's personal conditions for final disclosure had finally been met. William met his aunt privately, and the tension arrived before either of them said much. He knew Anne had watched him move through years of family strain, while carrying knowledge he had never been allowed to share. According to a documented account of their conversation, the prince asked how she could have remained silent when she knew his grandmother had built something around his future. Anne did not become defensive. She simply admitted that keeping Elizabeth's confidence had been one of the hardest duties her mother had ever placed on her. Anne then explained the condition that had governed everything. Elizabeth wanted William to receive the inheritance only after he had proved he could support the sovereign without surrendering his own judgment. That distinction mattered, because loyalty inside the monarchy could easily become obedience, and the Queen had feared that a future king who could never disagree would eventually lose the strength to lead. William listened as his aunt described the moment she believed the condition had been fulfilled. According to a recorded family account, preserved with the executor's papers, he had recently made a difficult decision that protected the crown but brought him no personal gain. He had supported Charles publicly, while privately holding a different view and refusing to use family pressure to force his preferred outcome. For Anne, that was the proof Elizabeth had been waiting for. Anne finally slid the authorization across the table. The document allowed the last sealed part of the inheritance to be released, but she kept one finger resting on it for a moment longer. Then she told William something he would not forget. Elizabeth never created this arrangement to make him richer, stronger, or more important. She created it to make him harder to own. William took the authorization, but the mystery was not finished. One final letter still waited for him, written in Elizabeth's own words. For the first time, William understood the structure, but Elizabeth's reasoning was still sealed inside one final letter, and opening it would transform the inheritance from a mystery into a personal farewell. The property could be valued. The trust could be counted. Every heirloom could eventually be catalogued. Elizabeth's letter could not. William had spent hours trying to understand why his grandmother created such an elaborate private arrangement. Then, he opened the message she had written specifically for the day he would finally learn the truth. Within minutes, the argument over wealth disappeared. What remained was a grandmother speaking to a grandson she knew would one day inherit responsibilities no private fortune could ever make lighter. William finally received the sealed message after every disclosure condition had been satisfied and the executor's procedures were complete. An executor is the person legally responsible for carrying out the instructions attached to someone's estate after death. Until that moment, the prince had understood the property, the heirlooms, the correspondence, and the protected trust as separate pieces of a complicated inheritance. Elizabeth's words changed that immediately. She had designed them as one legacy, built to preserve continuity in his private life rather than give him political power. William began reading alone. Halfway through, he stopped. According to a documented account later preserved with the family papers, he pressed the letter flat against the table and looked away when his grandmother addressed the loneliness attached to his future role. Elizabeth wrote about the danger of becoming surrounded by duty while feeling personally untethered. She understood that a future king could be praised by millions and still feel that every decision, every home, and every memory belonged partly to the institution. Catherine found him later, still carrying the weight of those words. She immediately sensed that something had changed, but William did not explain everything at once. He simply admitted that his grandmother had understood fears he had rarely said aloud. Catherine stayed with him as he described the hardest part. Elizabeth had not prepared the inheritance because she doubted his strength. She had prepared it because she knew strength could become exhausting when there was nowhere private to set the burden down. Then the letter revealed the purpose of the secluded property. Elizabeth wanted it preserved as a family refuge, somewhere William and his children could build memories, untouched by official expectations. The private collection carried the same meaning. Each object had been chosen because it connected to a family moment, not because of its market value. The trust existed to maintain that refuge independently, not to enrich the prince personally. William reached the final lines and found one last instruction. Before making any announcement or decision, Elizabeth wanted him to speak privately with Charles, not as heir speaking to sovereign, but as son speaking to father. William folded the letter himself and returned it to its envelope. He did not call for staff. He remained silent until Catherine understood that the inheritance had stopped being a mystery and become a farewell. Elizabeth had finally explained the gift. The next question was whether it would divide Charles and William, or become the very thing that allowed them to understand each other. The most important conversation in the entire inheritance story happened without lawyers, executors, courtiers, or advisors. William went to Charles carrying Elizabeth's letter, but he did not bring it as evidence. He brought it because his grandmother's final request demanded something the royal family often finds harder than ceremony: plain conversation. Two future chapters of the monarchy sat across from each other, and for once neither man needed to defend a title. They only needed to explain what Elizabeth had understood about them both. William entered that meeting with a different purpose than before. The prince no longer wanted to know who had kept the secret or who had approved the delay. Elizabeth's final message had forced him to see the inheritance as something separate from succession, the process by which the crown passes from one sovereign to the next. That mattered, because he had initially feared the gift might represent a private vote of confidence in him over his father. Now he understood that his grandmother had designed it to exist beside the monarchy, not above it. William admitted how angry he had been. According to a recorded private conversation, later summarized in a documented family account, he told Charles that the secrecy had made him wonder whether Elizabeth expected the two of them to end up on opposite sides. The future king had feared that every safeguard, every delayed instruction, and every protected asset pointed toward a conflict his grandmother believed was inevitable. Charles answered with an admission of his own. The king said his fear had been almost the reverse. He worried William might interpret the inheritance as Elizabeth quietly choosing the grandson over the son. That possibility had haunted him, because he knew how easily private affection could be mistaken for public judgment inside a family shaped by succession. For the first time, neither man was defending himself. They were admitting what each had been afraid to lose. William then explained the central meaning of the letter. Elizabeth had not chosen between them. She had tried to protect their relationship from the pressure that one day would place Charles on the throne and William directly behind him. The inheritance was not a weapon in that transition. It was a boundary around the prince's private identity. Charles reached toward the letter, then stopped. He asked whether his mother had written it for William alone. When the prince said yes, the king immediately withdrew his hand. The gesture carried more weight than another speech could have. Charles had accepted the line Elizabeth had drawn. Then came the surprise. The king told William to preserve every safeguard exactly as his grandmother had designed it. He should not fold the property, trust, or collection into wider royal arrangements simply to avoid criticism. Charles understood now that changing the structure would destroy its purpose. Father and son finally agreed on one response. They would stand together when the truth became public. Inside the family, the inheritance had finally produced understanding. Outside the palace walls, however, the revelation was about to become something far louder. For days, the inheritance had existed inside private rooms, sealed files, and difficult family conversations. Then the story escaped that silence. By morning, Elizabeth's final private decision was no longer something William could absorb quietly. Broadcasters debated its meaning. Commentators questioned the secrecy. Crowds gathered near royal gates, divided between fascination and sympathy. But one image dominated everything. William arriving for duty, after learning that his grandmother had prepared, years earlier, for a burden he had not yet fully inherited. William watched the story turn into a national argument almost overnight. The prince knew the distinction mattered. Private family assets belonged personally to the late queen, while crown property formed part of the institutional monarchy and could not simply be treated as personal wealth. That difference shaped the entire controversy. Palace communications also stressed that the inheritance changed nothing about constitutional succession, the legal order deciding who follows the sovereign, and gave William no new authority over public royal property. William hated watching Elizabeth's gesture reduced to numbers. Commentators speculated about values, estates, collections, and hidden wealth, while the meaning inside her letter disappeared beneath estimates. Catherine saw his frustration building and urged him not to fight every headline. According to a documented account of their private conversation, she reminded him that the inheritance had belonged to the family emotionally before the public ever learned it existed. William understood her point, but silence became harder as strangers began deciding what his grandmother had supposedly meant. Charles faced a different pressure. The king watched coverage repeatedly frame the inheritance as Elizabeth choosing William over him. Days earlier, that interpretation might have wounded their relationship deeply. Now it did not. Their private reconciliation had changed the ground beneath the story. According to a recorded conversation with senior aides, Charles refused any response that suggested rivalry between father and son. He would not allow public speculation to undo what his mother's final instructions had finally helped them repair. Then knowledge of Elizabeth's personal letter surfaced. Public curiosity exploded. William made one boundary clear through an official statement. The contents would remain private. The message belonged to a grandmother and grandson, not to the machinery of public debate. By morning, one newspaper captured the mood with a front page showing Elizabeth beside William beneath 3 words, her final gift. Later, people gathered outside Windsor Castle, leaving flowers and handwritten notes thanking the late queen. The reaction was not only about wealth. For many, it had become a story about someone preparing quietly for the emotional future of a person she loved. William felt that meaning personally during a scheduled engagement. As he arrived, one voice from the crowd called out, "Your grandmother knew you." The prince paused for a moment before continuing. The words landed because they reduced days of noise to one painful truth. The world had decided what Elizabeth's inheritance looked like from the outside. William now had to decide what it would mean from the inside, and what he would do with it. In the end, the secret inheritance was never truly about who received the property, how much the trust contained, or which heirlooms carried the greatest value. Those details created the shock. Elizabeth's reason created the meaning. She had spent her life belonging to an institution larger than herself, and she understood the price of that surrender better than anyone. Before she died, she quietly ensured that William, future king, son, husband and father, would inherit one small territory of life that duty could not completely consume. William finally understood the full shape of what Queen Elizabeth II had built for him. The secluded property, family heirlooms, personal correspondence, protected trust, and sealed message were not separate gifts. They were one private legacy, designed to give him continuity when the crown demanded almost everything else. A protected trust is a legal arrangement created to preserve assets under specific conditions rather than simply hand over money for personal use. That distinction mattered because Elizabeth had never intended this inheritance to become a competing center of royal power. William accepted the gift without trying to turn it into a statement against Charles. The prince understood that doing so would destroy the very meaning his grandmother had protected. According to a documented account of a private conversation with Catherine, he admitted that the most powerful part was not the property or the collection. It was realizing that Elizabeth had understood the emotional cost of his future long before he had found the words to explain it himself. Catherine reminded him that being understood that deeply was perhaps the rarest inheritance of all. Charles reached the same conclusion from a different direction. The king no longer saw his mother's decision as something that placed William above him. Their earlier private conversations had stripped that fear away. Father and son now understood that Elizabeth's safeguards were never built to divide them. They were built to stop succession, responsibility, and royal pressure from consuming their personal relationship completely. Charles accepted the arrangement without resentment, and William stopped viewing the secrecy as betrayal. William then made his final decision. He would preserve the property as Elizabeth intended, a private family refuge maintained separately, with the personal objects and correspondence kept together, rather than scattered or transformed into symbols of status. The future king would also keep her final letter private. The world could know that she had written it, but her last words to her grandson would not become another royal document pulled apart by endless public argument. William returned the letter to its envelope and placed it among the personal items she had preserved. He was not hiding the truth. He was protecting the boundary she had spent her life understanding. Elizabeth's secret inheritance did not crown William, empower him, or place him above his father. It did something far more intimate. It reminded a future king that before the monarchy could claim him completely, his grandmother had made certain a part of his life would always remain his own. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.